So you've written The Spanish Student, Evangeline, Hyperion, your cringy novel, The Song of Hiawatha, The Courtship of Miles Standish. Where do you go from there if you're Longfellow? Longfellow had written probably one of the most embarrassing novels of the American 19th century, but a half dozen of the greatest poems of the 19th century. And by the 1860s, he has this question of where do you go next? Well, one of the things that we see that Longfellow was doing really from the late 40s and into the 50s and onward is he's becoming more and more interested in writing about American history. You know, we often think about Longfellow with poems like The Midnight Ride of Paul Revere as that most American of poets. And yet Longfellow's early career with Hyperion, with Spanish Student, with a lot of his teaching on European literature, both at Bowdoin and in Harvard, he wasn't particularly America-focused in his early career, and he becomes more and more interested in the particular problems that face the eastern colonies of America and their history as he becomes an older and older man. He also moves more and more away from love stories to more complicated questions. This can be seen most in his plays that he titled The New England Tragedies. This is John Endicott and Giles Corey of Salem Farm. Now, as the name indicates, Giles Corey of Salem Farm is actually a kind of a dark comedy about the Salem witch trials. It doesn't have a strong heroine in it, and so we're going to pass over it, but it's worth a glance. But the one of these that is particularly interesting to us as we look at his heroines is John Endicott. Now, John Endicott is named after two men. One is John Endicott Sr., who was the governor of Boston in the early colonial era, and the other is John Endicott Jr., his son. Now, in the era that John Endicott Sr. was governor of Boston, there was a problem with the Quakers. Now, the Quakers were a very evangelistic, very extreme in the eyes of the Puritans, sect of Christianity who kind of preached fire and brimstone, repent and believe sermons, both to non-believers in the English colonies, but also to Puritans themselves. They thought that Puritans were not properly following God. One of the particular things that was distinct about the Quakers in comparison to the Puritans is that women were preachers and evangelists right alongside men. And to the Puritans, this was not okay. And in fact, in an early scene in this play, we get a picture of the woman who's going to be our heroine as she's debating with the Puritans who don't want her to preach in the city. Let's look at this. So we have this this man of the city, Norton, who has come and told the Quakers, you got to stop preaching. Norton says, "Silent, babbling woman, St. Paul commands all women to keep silent within the churches." And this woman, Edith Christison, one of the young Quaker preachers, says, "Yet the women prayed and prophesied at Corinth in his day, and among those on whom the fiery tongues of Pentecost descended, some were women." Norton responds, "The elders of the churches by our law alone have power to open the doors of speech and silence in the assembly. I command you." Edith responds, "The law of God is greater than your laws. Ye build your church with blood, your town with crime. The heads thereof give judgment for reward. The priests thereof teach only for their hire. Your laws condemn the innocent to death, and against this I bear my testimony." Edith, more than Priscilla in Courtship of Miles Standish, is a woman of bold speech. She's also a woman who knows her Bible and who knows her theology. Now, the Puritan-Quaker debate over proper preaching, I don't want to solve here. And yet, Longfellow clearly depicts Edith Christison, this young Quaker preacher, as firmly in the right, and the elders, the Puritan elders who oversee the town of Boston, is clearly in the wrong. Edith is a threat to Boston, and she and her fellow Quakers are a thorn in the side of John Endicott Sr. And much of the play involves them, the Quakers, being more and more bold in their preaching, and John Endicott getting more and more fed up with them, and then basically putting forth this edict that if any Quaker preaches in Boston, they will be whipped not only in Boston, but in other towns. They'll be paraded around being whipped around Massachusetts to show that Quakers need to shut up, especially women. So you can see, I think, a more explicitly bold and I think what we would call feminist theme to this play. Now, the interesting element isn't just, these men are mad at this woman and so persecute her. John Endicott Sr. has a son, John Endicott Jr., and John Endicott Jr. is caught between his father's Puritan severity and Edith's very evangelistic, even apocalyptic fervor. And John Endicott Jr., who the play is about just as much as John Endicott Sr., ends up moving over the course of the play from being the child of his father to kind of being the disciple of Edith. Now, there's this scene where Endicott Jr. has come to Edith and says, "Please don't go preach in Boston anymore. They're going to whip you, and you might die." And Edith responds this way: "Put this temptation under thy feet. To him that overcometh shall be given the white stone with a new name written on it, that no man knows save him that doth receive it. And I will give thee a new name, and call thee Paul of Damascus, and not Saul of Tarsus." Edith's mind is deeply biblically informed, and so she uses this image of the conversion of St. Paul, going from Saul of Tarsus, persecutor of Christians, to Paul, the chief Christian apostle. She basically tells John Endicott first, "Get thee behind me, Satan, don't tempt me," and then turns him into a Paul figure. You're not a Satan figure, you're not a tempter. You're just like Saul. You're the unredeemed Paul. "And I will give you a new name," she says. This is Edith kind of placing her in the self of God, in the place of God, giving a new name. Edith is so bold. And the poem ends with her preaching in Boston, being whipped, but surviving, and John Endicott coming and caring for her. Now, those of us who maybe really enjoyed The Courtship of Miles Standish or The Spanish Student might want, a cute romance to blossom between them. And yet, Longfellow is not interested in writing romances so much anymore in the 1860s into the 1870s. He's much more interested in these character studies. And as much as this play is about the John Endicotts, Edith is clearly the hero. John Endicott Sr. is the villain, Edith is the heroine, and John Endicott Jr. is the man who gets to watch it all and decide whose side he's on. But he's not the hero in the way that Edith is. I want to look at one more instance of Edith's theological and evangelistic brilliance. This is from a little before the temptation scene where, you should escape, I'll help you escape. No, I'm going to stay and be punished for God. This is Edith talking to the other Quakers who are hiding in Boston for fear of the Puritans. She says, "Truly we do but grope here in the dark, near the partition wall of life and death, at every moment dreading or desiring to lay our hands upon the unseen door. Let us then labor for an inward stillness and an inward healing, that perfect silence where the lips and heart are still, and we no longer entertain our own imperfect thoughts and vain opinions, but God alone speaks in us, and we wait in singleness of heart that we may know his will, and in the silence of our spirits that we may do his will, and do that only." Now, we could read this just as, a good old, very pious sermon she's giving. But she's really picking up on themes that Father Felician talked about in Evangeline that we looked at a few videos ago, that sorrow and silence are strong and patient endurance is godlike. And she's saying, if we find silence, God will begin to speak within us. It's once again this focus, like I said, we'd see later in Longfellow's life, on women who so conduct themselves and compose themselves in their societies that God shines forth and speaks forth out of them. They become godlike. They participate in God. Lest we think this language of participation in God is unwarranted. Just a few lines above, William Ledra, who's another one of the Quakers, he's just been whipped, and I think he's died at this point. And so they're talking about what should we do, and this prompts Edith and another guy, Wharton, to talk about what they should do. Wharton says, I am persuaded that God's armor of light as it is loved and lived in will preserve you. So doth the virtue and life of God flow evermore into the hearts of those whom he hath made partakers of his nature. So this language of partaking or participating in God's nature and the light of God protecting and interpenetrating the Christian. This is central to the imagery of heroism and bold defiance and endurance in John Endicott and in the life of Edith the heroine, just as it is in the language of Evangeline and the life of Evangeline the heroine. So we can see Longfellow's theological imagination begin to expand to American history, expand to women who have defied both political strictures and religious strictures, stopping them from praying. But these aren't women who are rejecting Christianity. These are women who are taking up the mantle and call to become Christ-like and to become God-like and to participate in God. They're taking up that mantle and call for themselves, and they are boldly acting in culture and in society as God's agents, as participants in his nature and in his light, and in illumining and bringing wisdom to those around them. It's a fascinating imagination that Longfellow has portrayed for us of what the heroine can be. And as I've said from the beginning of these lectures, it's this articulation of a harmony between individual calling of a woman's life above and beyond particular just cultural expectations or norms, and a very robust, even mystical understanding of what the Christian life is, and it's showing the harmony of them. We're almost at the end of the major heroines of Longfellow, and there are many other characters in Longfellow's plays and poems that we could look at and explore. But I hope these videos have given you a sense of the riches there are in Longfellow's work. There's one more major heroine to look at before we end, and that is going to be Vittoria Colonna, who is the last and final heroine of Longfellow's career. And we'll be doing a video on her soon. Thanks for listening. I've been Dr. Timothy Bartell.